Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're watching a special edition of The Listening Post. It's been 30 years now since the publication of one of the most influential books ever written about the institution that we cover, the media. Manufacturing Consent, The Political Economy of the Mass Media was co-authored by Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman. The book provided searing critiques of journalism and the news media's relationship to power. It spelled out how media corporations and the journalists who work for them often end up defending the economic, social, and political agendas of governments and corporations. It walked us through how the media represents certain privileged groups in society while effectively suppressing the voices of others. Most of us working on this program have been influenced in one way or another by Manufacturing Consent. And so, to mark the anniversary of its publication, we went to Tucson, Arizona, to talk to Noam Chomsky. It's a two-part interview. We began by showing Professor Chomsky the following animation, one that we made last year that boiled down some of the basic arguments that he and Herman made in Manufacturing Consent.
In 1988, Noam Chomsky co-authored a book with Edward Herman called Manufacturing Consent. It blasted apart the notion that media acts as a check on political powers. Media operate through 5 filters. The first has to do with ownership. Mass media firms are big corporations. Often they're part of even bigger conglomerates. Their endgame, profit. And so it's in their interests to push for whatever guarantees that profit. Critical journalism takes second place to the needs and interests of the corporation. The second filter exposes the real role of advertising. Media costs a lot more than consumers will ever pay. So who fills the gap? Advertisers. And what are the advertisers paying for? Audiences. And so it isn't so much that the media are selling you a product, their output. They're also selling advertisers a product, you. How does the establishment manage the media? That's the third filter. Journalism cannot be a check on power because the very system encourages complicity. Governments, corporations, big institutions know how to play the media game. They know how to influence the news narrative. They feed media scoops, official accounts, interviews with the experts. They make themselves crucial to the process of journalism. So those in power and those who report on them are in bed with each other. If you want to challenge power, you'll be pushed to the margins. Your name won't be down. You won't be getting in. You've lost your access. You've lost the story. When the media, journalists, whistleblowers, sources, stray away from the consensus, they get flat. That's the fourth filter. When the story is inconvenient for the powers that be, you'll see the flak machine in action, discrediting sources, trashing stories, and diverting the conversation. To manufacture consent, you need an enemy, a target. That common enemy is the fifth filter. Communism, terrorists, immigrants, a common enemy. A boogeyman to fear helps corral public opinion. 5 filters, one big media theory. Consent is being manufactured all around you, all the time.
So, Professor Chomsky, does that video capture the ideas that you wanted in that book?
I think it's brilliantly done, I think. Its success will be measured by whether it encourages people to ask, what does it mean when you have concentrated private power producing a product, namely audiences, for a market which consists of concentrated private power with tight links to state power. What do you expect the media output to look like with that framework of a structural framework behind it? If it encourages people to ask that question, I think it'll be very successful.
The title, Manufacturing Consent, it does get to the crux of how you see the role of the media in Western democracies. We get the feeling that you were out to destroy a few myths.
Well, interestingly, the phrase manufacturing consent was not ours. We borrowed it from the leading public intellectual of the 20th century, Walter Lippmann. He said that's a new art in democracy, to manufacture consent so that the ignorant and meddlesome outsiders, his phrase, the population, will be passive and acquiescent and will accept the rule of the responsible men, people like us. And in fact, the myth is that the media are independent, adversarial, courageous, struggling against power, and it's actually true of some. They're very fine, often very fine reporters, correspondents. In fact, the media does an honest, courageous job, but within a framework that determines what to discuss, what not to discuss. And what we try to demonstrate in the book is that if you simply look at the institutional structure of the media within a state capitalist society like ours, they're performing pretty much the way you'd expect.
We'll get back to the rest of that interview in just a few minutes. Over the years, Manufacturing Consent has sold millions of copies. It's had a profound influence on many accomplished journalists, and not just in the U.S. We spoke to three of them: the editor-in-chief of the Huffington Post's Indian edition, Aman Sethi, the Israeli journalist Amira Haas, and Matt Taibbi, an American best known for his work with Rolling Stone magazine. We asked them about the book, what they took from it, and the importance of critical analysis of the global news media today.
Manufacturing Consent had a big influence on me as a young reporter. I had always thought that we lived in a completely free society where the reporting was outstanding, the free press model worked exactly the way it should. And when I read that book, I realized that there were significant problems.
The book and the notion and the analysis, first of all, unveiled America of the myth of being such a splendid democracy. So it was part of Chomsky's and others and attempts to show that there are so many deficiencies in this democracy that are being ignored by many analysts.
He is saying that there is a superstructure of power that basically uses the media as propaganda. That is his broad formulation. And I would push back against that and say that it's not easy to manufacture that kind of consent today. Because when people receive news, it's not like people actually believe everything they see on the news, right? So I think one of the legacies of manufacturing consent has been that it kind of provided a neat formulation to sum up the unease that people felt with a monolithic production of information.
This is a very humanist and optimistic statement that believes that people with information can bring to a change. And this is how I started, really, when I started working in Gaza in the early 90s, where the Israeli public knows nothing about the occupation and what it means. I was waiting for my information to reach others and to change the awareness. And I realized quite soon that this was not the case.
Well, I think we've seen many graphic examples of how we can manufacture consent through the media. I think the ultimate example has to be the invasion of Iraq in 2003. If you had told Americans after 9/11 that we were going to invade a country that had no connection to the 9/11 hijackers, and that we were going to do it under the pretense of combating international terrorism, most people would have thought you were crazy. But we were able to sell that idea relatively easily to the entire American population.
This is Fox News and Fox News Channel continuing coverage of the campaign which now has begun to liberate and disarm Iraq.
But all they really needed was a few key voices among the highest opinion makers in the country and on TV.
The read we get on the people of Iraq is there's no question but what they want to get rid of Saddam Hussein, and they will welcome as liberators the United States when we come to do that.
And we were able to sell that war pretty easily.
I think sourcing is actually perhaps one of the most interesting filters that he talks about. I think sourcing is something that all journalists have to think a lot about. We should think very hard about which or what are the sources that we give credence and balance to, which are the sources that we give importance to, and which are the sources we don't give importance to.
So who decides about the hierarchy? What is important, what is not important? Very often I realize that if you have information that is official, this is called investigative journalism. But if you actually talk about the same thing from the mouth of the people themselves, let's say about dangers of a water contamination in Gaza, if it's the people themselves, this is not seen as a serious or as serious information as when it comes from an official.
I come from a family of journalists. My father was a reporter dating back to the 60s. When he started in the business, reporters tended to come from more humble origins. A lot of people didn't go to college. They entered the business as paper kids or as printers when they were 16 or so. But in the 70s, after all the president's men,
Woodward! Bernstein! Get in here!
Journalism became sexy. It became a thing for upper class Ivy League kids to do. And by the time I was in the business, and I'm partly representative of this problem because I came from that class myself. We all live in cities. We represent a certain point of view. We hang out with politicians and their aides. We are part of the ruling class, and our failure to recognize that, it's not necessarily through any fault of our own, but we're very separate and distinct from the ordinary person.
Chomsky's model produces a sense of inevitability, which is wrong. Even if I say that I have the freedom to write about whatever I want to write about, Chomsky will say, yeah, that's because there's already a filter in front of you and you don't even know what you can't write about.
How can you know that I'm self-censoring? How can you
I
know
don't say
that
you're
journalists
self-censoring. I'm sure you believe everything you're saying. But what I'm saying is if you believe something different, you wouldn't be sitting where you're sitting.
It's easy to say that people believe what they believe because their consent has been manufactured. But what if people know exactly what's going on and still believe what they believe, right? Then that's terrifying, right? And I think that's what even maybe Chomsky can't bring himself to look at. The fact that if people say, I don't care about the facts, I still believe that this should happen, then what do you say about the whole formulation of manufacturing consent?
The book and the concept are relevant because they offer to every journalist a kind of a lighthouse. It invokes people's skepticism, and this is always important. Though, as I said before, I think that the problems are that today we have so much access to information in other ways that we are in a collision with the fact that people are not interested in what does not serve immediately their interest. And this is a very sad realization.
So I think the legacy of Chomsky's book in that sense is that it provides us with a manual of commonly made mistakes. And so I think it's something that then makes us think about what we're doing and makes us more mindful of our journalism.
When you wrote this book in 1988, roughly 50 corporations controlled every single mass media outlet in the United States. Now there are just 6, Time Warner, Viacom, News Corp, Disney among them. What effect has that had, do you think, on democracy in America?
All of that cheapens and reduces the access to information and understanding. Now, there is a way to compensate for that. The internet does allow us to reach to, if people organize, form collectives, interact with one another, it's possible to use the enormous resources that are available to overcome the impact of the concentration of media, and in fact can be done pretty effectively.
Earlier this year, American television viewers were treated to the spectacle on the Sinclair Broadcasting System, which is not that well known a company, but which owns hundreds of local affiliates in the United States.
The sharing of biased and false news has become all too common on social media.
They put out an editorial, an editorial where the same words were read by hundreds of different news anchors in small cities from Kansas to the Florida Panhandle. What did you make of all those news anchors in all those markets mouthing those same words and reading those same scripts?
And remember, compelled to do so. They didn't have a choice. You wanted to stay and keep your job, you read what Big Brother told you to read. This is a mode of propaganda that we associate with totalitarian states. The fact that it's done by a private tyranny, which is what a corporation is, doesn't change the character of it. And it's kind of interesting that in actual totalitarian states, say the old Soviet Union, studies showed that people tended to distrust the media because it was so obvious that it was coming from the state authorities.
I always found it interesting that after the wall came down, all these Western journalists were sent in by various Western foundations to train journalists from Eastern Europe, Warsaw Pact countries. But what I knew of those places was that their news consumers were far more discerning about what information they were taking in. And I thought rather than sending Western journalists to quote unquote train Russian or Polish journalists, we should send news consumers from those countries to come west to train us. What do you think of that idea?
Well, the studies of the old Soviet Union, which were intensive, showed that a large part of the population recognized that what they're getting is controlled, authoritarian centered propaganda. The Western system propaganda is nowhere near that crude. It looks independent. There is a certain amount of variety. When Sinclair sends out a demand that everyone read the same editorial, that's unusual. It's not the kind of thing that's done in the Western system. In the Eastern system, it was done, and that does lead to a healthy skepticism. That's exactly what you noticed.
We don't have to go back far to the halcyon days of social media. The Arab Spring 2011, so much optimism in the air and a belief that the rise of these alternative voices on these platforms would have a democratizing effect on governance. Turns out that was misguided. What happened?
Well, first of all, there is a positive aspect to the social media. Almost all activist movements rely on them to bring people together and so on. So what happened in the first months of the Arab Spring was very exciting. You may recall that at one point the dictator Mubarak closed the internet to try to prevent the social media from functioning. What happened is that activism increased, because instead of sending messages out electronically, people actually talk to each other. Now that's the essential way to organize and create a kind of culture of what I call collective self-defense.
You couldn't have foreseen the emergence of the tech giants who are such a big part of the global news media today. and their rise has made them unwieldy purveyors of power. They've grown rich at the expense of many media outlets. Has anyone come up with useful ways of how and what to do with them? How to deal with them and what to do with them?
Well, not really. Remember that these are not the sources of news. Like Facebook doesn't have bureaus around the world. What these have created is an array of social media, which are double-edged. Sometimes they're used for constructive purposes, but they have also become major forces for undermining democracy. We see that everywhere. Right now in Brazil, for example, a scandal's erupting correctly about the fact that millions of dollars were spent to produce defamatory information on the social media against the PT, the Workers' Party, to support the literally neo-fascist candidate who won the campaign. It's only one example. These things are now happening over and over, and it's a very dangerous phenomenon.
You've written a great deal about Latin America, and a few years back, leaders such as Chavez in Venezuela, Morales in Bolivia, the Kirchners in Argentina, Correa in Ecuador, they were all pushing for some form of media reform to spread ownership out, to limit the power of conglomerates in Latin America. Their critics then accused them of basically trying to usurp the powers from the political right and drag them off to the left. Did the critics of those leaders who were trying to reform media in Latin America actually have a point?
In fact, the problem in all of the countries you mentioned is they didn't do anywhere near enough to try to set up alternative, independent, publicly controlled media that would counter the high concentration of ultra-right media in Latin America, which has been a scandal for years.
Manufacturing Consent is considered a seminal work. It's not an easy read for people. It's a difficult area to explore and dissect, on television in particular, because of its limitations and the limited attention spans of some of the people who are watching this program. In conveying some of these ideas, have you ever thought of taking some of those media training courses that those corporate executives take that train them to speak in sound bites?
No.
Probably not, huh?
Yeah. I remember once that there was a program called Nightline on television.
ABC.
And they got a lot of criticism because I was never on it. And the director said, I'm not the kind of person they could have on because I don't understand concision, namely saying two sentences between ads. And that's a terrific form of propaganda. So, for example, if you're asked, is Iran a terrorist state? You can say, yes, they do this and that and the other thing. If you're asked, is the United States a terrorist state, which is, of course, way beyond Iran, you can't say it in 2 minutes, because first you have to break down the prejudices and assumptions and dogmas about the United States being a force for freedom and democracy. You can't do that between two ads. So the very idea of concision is a fine technique for imposing the propaganda of the power of those who are powerful. They can say anything they want against enemies in 2 minutes, but they can't be exposed in 2 minutes.
Final question for you. When you get up in the morning, where do you go to get your news?
First thing I look at is the New York Times.
Still?
It's still, with all of its flaws, and they're real, it still has the broadest and most comprehensive coverage of, I think, any newspaper in the world.
And then where do you go from there?
Then many other places. Washington Post, the business press, foreign press, Al Jazeera, Democracy Now!, many other sources.
Noam Chomsky, thank you so much for joining us, The Listening Post.
Thank you.
One of the last points that Chomsky made about starting his news day with the New York Times, we included that because we found his response telling. Noam Chomsky is among the Times' sharpest critics, But he doesn't simply dismiss the newspaper. He doesn't, as so many people suspicious of the mainstream media have, cut the cord and live in a world void of conventional news outlets. He goes there, but he considers the source. He does the diligence, shops around, gets other views, sometimes from outside the American news bubble. He co-wrote the book 30 years ago, but there's a lesson in there for news consumers trying to make sense of the media today. You've been watching a special edition of our program. We'll see you next time here at The Listening Post.